Genesis, Creation, and Early Man, by Father Seraphim Rose. Editor's Preface. The story behind the book. This book, compiled and published posthumously, represents one of the most important achievements in the life of the great patristic philosopher, Father Seraphim Rose. It is an exhaustive collection of all the relevant material, both from manuscripts and from transcriptions of tape-recorded lectures, that Father Seraphim produced on the subject of Genesis and creation over the course of 9 years, up until his repose in 1982. As such, it can be used by the serious student of patristic philosophy as a compendium that may be referred to over and over again. But it is more than a textbook. Behind the posthumously gathered components of this book there lies a story within the whole story of Father Seraphim's life and work, which was always concerned with the ultimate meaning of the beginning and end of all things. It is our purpose here to tell that story. 1. The intellectual milieu of Father Seraphim, formative years. In the 1950s, when Father Seraphim, then Eugene, Rose was attending high school and college in California, the theory of evolution was at the height of its prestige. Its ascendancy over all competing views of the origin of life and the universe culminated in the great Darwin Centennial Celebration at the University of Chicago in 1959, commemorating the publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species 100 years earlier. Scientists came from all over to share in the triumph, not only of a scientific theory, but of a worldview. As Philip E. Johnson writes, the participants in the Darwin Centennial were understandably in a triumphal mood. The prestige of science was never higher. Polio had been conquered by a vaccine. Atomic power seemed to promise abundant, cheap energy. Space travel loomed in the near future. Besides these technological achievements, science had seemingly established that a purposeless process of evolution was our true creator, and hence had dethroned the God of the Bible. The religious implications of this intellectual revolution were frankly emphasized by the most prominent speaker at the Centennial, the British biologist, philosopher, and world statesman Sir Julian Huxley. Julian Huxley was the grandson of Thomas Henry Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog, because he was the most important early champion of Darwin's theory. T.H. Huxley had also invented the word agnostic to describe his own religious views. Julian Huxley, a zoologist, was one of the scientific founders of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, the modern version of Darwin's theory. He was also the promoter of a naturalistic religion called evolutionary humanism, and the founding Secretary-General of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. In short, Julian Huxley was one of the most influential intellectuals of the mid-20th century, and 1959 was the high-water mark of his influence. Here are some excerpts from Huxley's remarks at the Centennial. Future historians will perhaps take this Centennial Week as epitomizing an important critical period in the history of this earth of ours, the period when the process of evolution, in the person of inquiring man, began to be truly conscious of itself. This is one of the first public occasions on which it has been frankly faced that all aspects of reality are subject to evolution, from atoms and stars to fish and flowers, from fish and flowers to human societies and values. Indeed, that all reality is a single process of evolution. In 1859, Darwin opened the passage leading to a new psychosocial level, with a new pattern of ideological organization, an evolution-centered organization of thought and belief. In the evolutionary pattern of thought, there is no longer either need or room for the supernatural. The earth was not created, it evolved. So did all the animals and plants that inhabit it, including our human selves, mind and soul, as well as brain and body. So did religion. Evolutionary man can no longer take refuge from his loneliness in the arms of a divinized father figure whom he has himself created, nor escape from the responsibility of making decisions by sheltering under the umbrella of divine authority, nor absolve himself from the hard task of meeting his present problems and planning his future by relying on the will of an omniscient, but unfortunately inscrutable, providence. Finally, the evolutionary vision is enabling us to discern, however incompletely, the lineaments of the new religion that we can be sure will arise to serve the needs of the coming era. In short, the triumph of Darwinism implied the death of God and set the stage for replacing biblical religion with a new faith based on evolutionary naturalism. That new faith would become the basis not just of science, but also of government, law, and morality. It would be the established religious philosophy of modernity. Some of the world's most eminent scientists, from Richard Owen and Louis Agassiz in the 1860s to Richard Goldschmidt and Otto Schindewolf in the 1940s, had shown to the scientific community the embarrassing difficulties of the theory that was being heralded at the Darwin Centennial, but these scientists had been held up to ridicule and their valid objections dismissed out of hand. In addition to these vocal critics, there was a silent group of scientists who disagreed with evolutionary theory but were afraid to challenge the prevailing worldview. The existence of this group was even acknowledged at the Darwin Centennial by the paleontologist Everett Clare Olson of the University of California, who said, "It is difficult to judge the size and composition of this silent segment, but there is no doubt that the numbers are not inconsiderable." Whether they were silenced or chose to remain silent, the many scientists who questioned Darwinism were not heard by the American people. Consequently, when Father Seraphim began studying science in high school and college in the early 1950s, he was taught that the evolution of all life from a primeval soup was an undisputed and unassailable fact, as sure, in Julian Huxley's words, as the fact that Earth goes around the sun. 1. From the evolutionary worldview to the Orthodox worldview. Possessed of a brilliant mind, Father Seraphim from a young age exhibited a burning desire to know, to understand reality in the highest sense. In high school he zealously sought knowledge in science and mathematics, biology, zoology, algebra. Graduating at the top of his class, he was granted a scholarship to Pomona College in Southern California, thanks to the enthusiastic endorsement of his math teacher. At Pomona he continued his study of science, which he now combined with a study of philosophy. Under the influence of the humanists of his time, he joined in the grand enterprise of thinkers like Julian Huxley to explain the universe without God. In a freshman philosophy paper, 1952, he stated, "All science points to the existence of the universe, the totality of all things. Nothing in science points to the existence of a God removed from the universe. For the present time, since I have not yet developed my own theory of knowledge, I assume for convenience sake that I can gain knowledge, as certain as it can be obtained, through science. Therefore, I believe in the findings of science that point to the existence of the universe. I reject the concept of an independent God for insufficient evidence." This statement may seem naive nowadays, when the despotism of scientific naturalism is being increasingly challenged, but it must be considered in the context of the 1950s, the decade of the ascendancy of humanism, and the triumphal pronouncements of the Darwin Centennial. "At one time I believed entirely in evolution," Father Seraphim was later to recall. "I believed not because I had thought very much about this question, but simply because everyone believes it, because it is a fact, and how can one deny facts? I still remember my freshman professor of zoology expatiating on the great ideas of man. For him the greatest idea man ever invented was the idea of evolution. Much greater, he believed, than the idea of God." Ultimately, Father Seraphim, striving to understand the meaning of reality, could not be satisfied by modern science, dedicated as it was to materialism, nor by Western philosophy, which had been founded in rationalism. "I was an undergraduate," he later recalled, "looking for some kind of truth in philosophy, and not finding it. I was very bored with Western philosophy." During his sophomore year, he began to seek higher wisdom in the philosophy of ancient China, for which he undertook a study of the Chinese language, both ancient and modern. Father Seraphim graduated from Pomona College in 1956 and pursued his study of ancient Chinese language and philosophy at the Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco and later at the University of California in Berkeley. While at the Academy, he discovered the writings of the 20th century French metaphysician René Guénon, a traditionalist who looked to the ancient, orthodox expressions of the world's religions for answers to ultimate questions. Guénon both clarified and transformed Father Seraphim's intellectual outlook. Later he wrote, "It was Guénon who taught me to seek and love the truth above all else, and to be unsatisfied with anything else." Father Seraphim's education had taught him to view all things in terms of historical progress, according to the evolutionary worldview of the modern age. Upon discovering Guénon, he began to see things in terms of historical disintegration. In his book The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times, Guénon explained how the elimination of traditional spiritual principles has led to a drastic degeneration of humanity. He showed how 20th century science, with its tendency to reduce everything to an exclusively quantitative level, has corrupted man's conception of true knowledge and confined his vision to what is temporal and material. Guénon wrote elsewhere that, in attempting to reduce everything to the stature of man taken as an end in himself, modern civilization has sunk stage by stage to a level of his lowest elements and aims at little more than satisfying the needs inherent in the material side of his nature. Trying to fill in the gap left by science and materialism in the modern age, pseudo-religions have sprung up, but in their confusion of psychic with spiritual reality, they have only further obscured the truth. Guénon wrote that the modern world considered in itself as an anomaly and even a sort of monstrosity, and he regarded the modern scientific theory of evolution, which was developed in an attempt to explain the universe purely naturalistically, as an offspring of this monstrosity. In evolutionism, he wrote, all reality is placed exclusively in becoming, involving the final denial of all immutable principle and consequently of all metaphysic. It is likely that Guénon caused Father Seraphim to question evolutionism even before the latter began his conversion to Orthodox Christianity. I began to think more deeply on this question of evolutionism, Father Seraphim later recalled. I began to see that very often what calls itself science is not fact at all, but philosophy, and I began very carefully to distinguish between scientific facts and scientific philosophy. In his freshman year at Pomona, Father Seraphim had trusted the modern scientific outlook. With his study of Guénon, he was still to regard modern science as a way to knowledge, but now he saw this as knowledge of the lowest, commonest sort. Guénon had shown Father Seraphim what to leave behind and had started him on the path to truth, but he had not shown him the final destination. He found this destination when, by a miracle, he discovered that the truth he was seeking was a person, Jesus Christ, whose image was preserved undistorted in the Orthodox transmission of the very Christianity he had previously rejected. In Orthodox Christianity, Father Seraphim found the true, ancient worldview to replace the modern evolutionary one, and the key to this worldview he found in the writings of the Orthodox Holy Fathers. The theology of the Holy Fathers, he understood, was based on the living, personal revelation of God to man, and thus was of an infinitely higher order not only than science, but even than the metaphysical insights he had gained through Guénon. He never ceased to appreciate the crucial step that Guénon had given him on his path to truth, but now he saw that the path of metaphysics, which places the intellection of the human mind above divinely revealed theology, is fraught with dangers, and thus leads to subtle errors mixed in with higher truths. While before he had relied on his mind to arrive at truth, now he knew he had to humble his mind before the truth as person, Jesus Christ. Shortly after his conversion he wrote, "When I became a Christian I voluntarily crucified my mind, and all the crosses that I bear have only been a source of joy for me. I have lost nothing and gained everything." 3. The roots of evolutionism. During the early years following his conversion, Father Seraphim made a thorough examination of the philosophical history of Western civilization in order to fully understand the past causes, present state, and future development of the West's apostasy from the old order of traditional Christian civilization. Out of this study was to come his philosophical magnum opus, entitled The Kingdom of Man and the Kingdom of God. In Chapter 4 of the proposed work, Father Seraphim was to discuss the new physics propounded at the end of the Renaissance by the rationalists Bacon and Descartes, which viewed the universe as a closed system and aimed at giving first and natural, i.e., not divine, causes to all physical phenomena. Footnote: for a good discussion of the historical roots of naturalism, see Michael Denton Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, pages 71 to 73. Return to text. In the same chapter, he was to describe the modern philosophy of progress which arose at the end of the Enlightenment, displacing the stable worldview that had characterized much of Enlightenment thought. These two a priori philosophical commitments, to naturalism and to progress, formed the seedbed out of which came the theory of evolution, which was first proposed by Charles Darwin's grandfather Erasmus in 1794. As Father Seraphim later observed, this theory developed together with the course of modern philosophy from Descartes onward, long before there was any scientific proof for it. The research Father Seraphim did for his proposed book was prodigious. Thousands of pages of notes were written, but the work was never completed, save for Chapter 7 on nihilism. Footnote: published posthumously as a separate book, Eugene Father Seraphim Rose, Nihilism, The Root of the Revolution of the Modern Age, 1994. Return to text. By 1963, along with his co-laborer, the future Father Herman, he was heavily involved in beginning an Orthodox Christian Brotherhood in San Francisco and opening the first city storefront in America that sold exclusively Orthodox materials. 4. the mind of the Holy Fathers. In the meantime, Father Seraphim's spiritual mentor, the saint and miracle worker Archbishop John Maximovich, had begun a series of theological courses, which Father Seraphim attended several times a week for 3 years. Although Father Seraphim was an American convert and all the courses were conducted in Russian, he graduated at the head of the class. Among the many subjects covered, he was taught patristics by Bishop Nectary, a disciple of Optina Monastery, who later ordained him to the priesthood, and Old Testament by Archimandrite Spiridon, a clairvoyant elder and the closest man to Archbishop John. Here, in contrast to the rationalistic evolutionary ideas he had been taught while growing up, Father Seraphim learned the revelation of God himself regarding the creation of the universe and the nature of the first created world, as passed on through the scriptures and the God-bearing Holy Fathers throughout the centuries. Father Seraphim's instructors, Archbishop John, Bishop Nectary and Father Spiridon, were themselves holy fathers of modern times, and thus Father Seraphim was able to receive the patristic transmission not only from books, but from living bearers of that transmission. It was through the lips of living repositories of sanctity that the meaning of Genesis was opened to him. In 1969, Fathers Herman and Seraphim moved to the mountains of Northern California, where they became monks and continued their Orthodox missionary work through writing, translating, and printing Orthodox material. There, in their forest hermitage, Father Seraphim continued to fill himself with the scriptures and the writings of the Fathers, feeding on the true pastures of the soul. Over years of study, he acquired extensive knowledge of patristic teaching, which had already been placed in the proper context for him through the courses he had attended in San Francisco. In addressing a particular issue in his writings, he would make use of a wide range of patristic sources, both ancient and modern, from both Eastern and Western Christendom, many of them quite obscure and never before rendered in English. Father Seraphim's aim, however, was not to become a scholar whose specialty was the Holy Fathers. Such experts, he wrote, are often total strangers to the true patristic tradition and only make their living at its expense. As always, he had to go deeper to get the whole picture. He had not only to grasp the Fathers' writings intellectually, but to actually acquire their mind, to learn to think, feel, and look at things as they did. He wanted their attitude to be his attitude. Too often in contemporary orthodoxy, the tendency is to reinterpret the faith in order to conform it to the mind of modern man. Father Seraphim knew he had to do just the opposite, to conform his consciousness to the mind of the Fathers, to plug himself fully into the 2,000-year continuity of Christian experience. He actually suffered over this, praying fervently to God. He personally addressed the ancient Holy Fathers as fellow believers in the body of Christ and as vehicles of divine wisdom, so that he would be given to see how they apprehended reality. He felt especially close to the 4th century Father, Saint Basil the Great, who among his many other major achievements wrote the definitive patristic commentary on the 6 days of creation. In introducing the lives and writings of the Fathers to modern-day readers, Father Seraphim wrote of their inestimable worth. There is no problem of our own confused times which cannot find its solution by a careful and reverent reading of the Holy Fathers, whether complex philosophical questions such as evolution, or the straightforward moral questions of abortion, euthanasia, and birth control. In all these questions, the Holy Fathers and our living Fathers who follow them are our only sure guide. 5. Evolution and Chiliasm. While working on the kingdom of man and the kingdom of God, Father Seraphim had identified the faith of modern man as a secular form of Chiliasm, the belief in the inevitability of progress and in the perfectibility of this fallen world. Evolutionism, in its belief in the gradual development from the lower to the higher, was closely bound up with Chiliasm. In Father Seraphim's words, it was an almost inevitable deduction from it. Together with Chiliasm, evolution was what Father Seraphim called a deep-seated primordial force, which seems to capture people quite apart from their conscious attitudes and reasoning. There's a good reason for that. It's been drilled into everyone from the cradle, and therefore is very hard to bring out and look at rationally. Echoing the words of Julian Huxley, who at the Darwin Centennial had called evolution a pattern of thought, Father Seraphim said that it was a rival thought pattern to orthodoxy, not just another idea. And this thought pattern, he observed, followed a course that was just the opposite of what Christianity teaches. The evolutionary philosophy of up from the beasts certainly seems irreconcilable with the Christian view of fall from paradise, and our whole view of history will certainly be determined by which way we believe. It was the chiliastic/evolutionary thought pattern that had produced such politico-religious movements as international socialism, globalism, and ecumenism. All such movements share the same chiliastic goal, a coming new order in which all previous standards, seen as relative to a particular stage in a process, will be entirely changed. Just as all distinctions between organisms are blurred in the idea of biological evolution, as the organisms change into one another over millions of years, so too all distinctions between nations and religions are blurred in the chiliastic New World Order. 6. Traditionalists in favor of evolution. To Father Seraphim, it was self-evident that evolutionism, with its innumerable corollaries in modern thought and life, was antithetical to the Orthodox worldview that he had embraced. He wrote, "I have always regarded evolution in all its ramifications as an important part of the modern American intellectual baggage which I left behind when I became Orthodox, and it never occurred to me that any aware Orthodox Christian would regard it as unimportant, especially now when many scientists have abandoned it purely on scientific grounds. When the pseudo-religious presuppositions of its supporters are so evident, and when it is so much bound up with Masonry ecumenism and the whole pseudo-religious outlook." Just how far his fellow Orthodox Christians had gone in accepting evolutionism was first made known to Father Seraphim in 1973. In February of that year, he helped and encouraged a public school teacher, A.Y., to write and publish an Orthodox article against evolution. This article, as Father Seraphim later wrote, touched something very deep. It raised a highly volatile subject which until then most Orthodox Christians in the West had preferred not to discuss. Soon after the article appeared, articles began coming out in mainstream Orthodox journals, especially those of the Orthodox Church in America and the Greek Archdiocese, in support of evolutionism. This was not surprising to Father Seraphim, for he had known ever since his conversion that many of the mainstream Orthodox in America had capitulated to the spirit of this world and its intellectual fashions. However, he was genuinely surprised when his fellow traditionalist Orthodox, who like him were opposed to ecumenism, also came out in favor of evolutionism and roundly censured A.Y. because of his article. Frankly, Father Seraphim wrote, "We are astonished that people who are so keen on ecclesiastical matters, ecumenism, etc., should seem never to have given much thought to such an important thing as evolution. Apparently it is because it seems to be outside the church sphere." To one of these traditionalist Orthodox, Father Seraphim wrote, "We fully agree with A.Y. that evolution is one of the most dangerous concepts that faces Orthodox Christians today. Perhaps it is the very key, intellectual, to the assault upon the Church, to the very philosophy, and there is such a thing, of the coming Antichrist." With this in mind, he encouraged A.Y. to write a booklet on evolutionism. In the meantime, he made his own in-depth study, both of the scientific theory of evolution and of the teaching of the Holy Fathers regarding creation, the first created world and the first created man. He discovered that the ancient fathers, although they of course did not refute evolution per se, since it had not been invented until recent times, provided a definite refutation of its main tenets. They spoke at length on the distinction between the kinds of organisms both at the time of their creation and afterwards, and were clearly against any philosophy that would confuse this distinction. Their teaching allowed for variation within each kind, which is observable and scientifically demonstrable, but was adamantly opposed to the idea that one kind could be transformed into another, which to this day has not been proved scientifically. Having studied the doctrine of the Holy Fathers touching on the creation of man and the world, Father Seraphim found it so clear that he was simply amazed at the power evolution has over even educated Orthodox minds. Such is the power of this world and its fashionable ideas. All the living transmitters of patristic tradition, whom Father Seraphim knew, were aware that evolutionary theory was a faith rather than pure science. The critics of A.Y.'s article, however, kept holding up a traditionalist Orthodox writer and medical doctor, Dr. Alexander Kalamiros, as one who was pro-evolution. Not being able to read Kalamiros' article in Greek, Father Seraphim was frustrated at having his name repeatedly thrown at him in this way. He had appreciated the English translation of Kalamiros' strong critique of ecumenism against false union, and could not imagine how the same author could be in favor of evolution. He wrote to Kalamiros asking his views, and the latter promised to send a detailed reply in English, with quotes from the Holy Fathers. "We look forward to this with open mind and some expectation," wrote Father Seraphim. "We hope to receive a confirmation of our suspicion, that he is quite wrongly used as virtually a proponent of evolution. Several months later, Fathers Herman and Seraphim received a 40-page epistle from Calamiros. "I must confess," wrote Father Seraphim, "that it is shocking beyond our expectations, giving the evolutionary teaching quite unadorned and unqualified, complete with the evolved beast Adam, and he who denies evolution denies the sacred scriptures. In a way, however, we are rather glad of this, because now for the first time we have found a reputable Orthodox evolutionist who is willing to be quite frank about matters which others, I believe, are afraid to speak up about." Father Seraphim put all his energy into composing a reply, which turned out to be as long as Dr. Calamiro's letter. Father Seraphim's letter, a treatise, actually, is a masterpiece of patristic thought, and we today can only be grateful that his correspondence with Dr. Calamiros inspired him to write it. Up to today, it is the clearest, most complete patristic refutation of evolution ever written. 7. The scientific side of the question. By this time, the original idea of coming out with a booklet on evolutionism no longer seemed adequate to Father Seraphim. Now he and A.Y. began to plan writing a complete book. Father Seraphim was to write about the patristic teaching on creation and early man, and also about the philosophical origins of evolution, while A.Y. was to write about evolution as scientific theory and about Christian evolution. "Our study," wrote Father Seraphim, "is supposed to give a complete picture, which hopefully will clarify many minds. It certainly clarified my own mind, since previously I hadn't thought in detail on many aspects of the question." Father Seraphim's correspondence with Dr. Calamiros had underlined for him the importance of being abreast with scientific discussions on the subject of evolution. Dr. Calamiros had prided himself on standing superior to these discussions, since they were Western and thus not Orthodox. As Father Seraphim pointed out, however, the question of evolution can't be discussed at all if one doesn't have a basic grasp of the scientific side of it, the scientific proofs of it, as well as the broader philosophy of evolution based on it, Teilhard de Chardin, etc. By this I don't mean that one has to be a scientific specialist in order to discuss the scientific side of the question. The scientific side is not the most important one, and specialists usually trip themselves up by concentrating too much on it. But if one isn't sufficiently aware of the scientific side, one won't be able to grasp the question in its full scope. One can't say with assurance, for example, whether man has been on Earth some 7,000 or 8,000 years, more or less, as the Fathers often say, if one is totally ignorant of the principles of radiometric dating, geologic strata, etc., which prove that man is millions of years old. And such knowledge is not esoteric at all. The basic principles of radiometric dating, enough to show its strong and weak points, can be explained in a rather short article asterisk. This is just a sample to show that to get anywhere in this question, one must have a basic, layman's awareness of the scientific evidences for and against evolution. If one is reasonably objective and not out to prove one's point at any cost, such questions need not arouse passionate debates. As a basic principle, of course, we must assume that scientific truth, as opposed to various opinions and prejudices, cannot contradict revealed truth if only we understand both correctly. During the first half of the 20th century, as we have seen, scientists were loath to question the evolutionary model. They would test every hypothesis save that one, for on it everything else, all their classification of data, rested. Those few scientists, including some very important ones, who dared to undermine this dogma were considered heretics and were blacklisted. When Dr. Calamiros was going to school in the 1950s, it was not only unfashionable but positively anathema not to believe in evolution, and hence his attempt, as a patristic scholar, to make the ancient fathers believe it as well. After the 1950s, this situation began to change. One by one, the silent dissenters mentioned at the Darwin Centennial began to surface. Reputable scientists began raising serious doubts about evolution, and there were just too many of them to be silenced. New advances in the hard sciences of molecular genetics, embryology, etc., were making it very difficult for scientists to reconcile their data with the neo-Darwinian model. Scientific books came out which were critical of Darwin's theory, including Implications of Evolution, 1961, by G. A. Kirkett, professor of physiology and biochemistry at the University of Southampton, England, and L'Evolution du Vivant, 1973, by Pierre P. Gros, one of the world's greatest living biologists and ex-president of the French Academy of Sciences. Dr. Gross ended his book by issuing this devastating indictment of Darwinian evolution. Through use and abuse of hidden postulates, of bold, often ill-founded extrapolations, a pseudoscience has been created. It is taking root in the very heart of biology and is leading astray many biochemists and biologists who sincerely believe that the accuracy of fundamental concepts has been demonstrated, which is not the case. In spite of such statements by mainstream scientists, the debate as to whether evolutionary theory was a pseudoscience remained for the most part within the walls of the scientific establishment. It was still not known to the public. As far as the American public was concerned, evolution was still just as much an incontrovertible fact in the 1970s as it had been in the 1950s, when both Father Seraphim and Dr. Calamiros had gone to college. People wishing to learn what was really happening in the scientific community would have to familiarize themselves with specialized books and journals. In his sincere desire to know what modern science had to say about evolution, what was actually proved and what was speculation, Father Seraphim studied the mainstream scientific literature, as well as popular treatments of the proofs of evolution and human origins. He also spoke to scientists working within the prevailing establishment, who told him that many of the evolutionists themselves admitted that there was not actual proof for it, but that it makes more sense, or the alternative is unthinkable, i.e., God's creation. For a true scientist, they maintained, the pure theory of evolution is a convenient means of classifying, and another model equally scientific would be just as acceptable. Through his studies and personal contacts, Father Seraphim, although he possessed no scientific degrees, became more abreast of the current status of evolutionary theory than Dr. Calamiros. Assuring Dr. Calamiros that he was not against science, he wrote to him, "You seem to be unaware of the great mass of scientific literature in recent years which is highly critical of the evolutionary theory, which talks about relegating it to poetry and metaphors instead of scientific theory. Professor Constance, professor of botany at the University of California, Berkeley, or even deny its validity altogether. If you wish, but it is quite pointless. I could indeed compile a list of hundreds, if not thousands, of reputable scientists who now either disbelieve in evolution entirely or state that it is highly questionable scientific theory." In his studies, Father Seraphim appreciated the work of the scientific creationists, a group of Protestant Christians who were also professional scientists. The creation science movement had been catalyzed in America with the publication of the seminal textbook The Genesis Flood by Dr. Henry Morris and Dr. John Whitcomb in 1960, only a year after the Darwin centennial. Footnote: in 1932 a similar movement had started in England, calling itself the Evolution Protest Movement. Its prime mover was biologist Douglas Dewar. Continuing its work to this day, it is now known as the creation science movement. Return to text. And its growth had precisely coincided with the growing doubts about evolutionary theory within the scientific establishment. From its inception, its strategy was to emphasize not how much evolution contradicts the Bible, but how much it contradicts scientific evidence. Its early success and influence caused evolutionists to take the offensive, caricaturing the creationists and accusing them of religious bias while not acknowledging their own religious bias. As Dr. Henry Morris wrote, "The answer of the evolutionary establishment to the creationist arguments has not been scientific, but emotional. Intimidation is evidently the game plan. The ACLU files or threatens to file lawsuits wherever a two-model creation/evolution approach is considered in a school district. A veritable stream of anti-creationist tirades has poured forth from the liberal news media, as well as the journals and books of the educational/scientific establishment. Evolutionists publicly gloat over the merest suggestion of a misquotation or misrepresentation which they can discover in the copiously documented creationist literature, while their own writings are saturated with out-of-context quotes and flagrant distortions of the creationist arguments. Thus, by the time Father Seraphim was making an in-depth study of this subject in the early 1970s, the creationist movement had been made an object of ridicule in the public mind. Father Seraphim himself was at first somewhat skeptical about the movement, not because he was swayed by public opinion, in which he had absolutely no trust, but because he saw the movement as being based on the rationalistic, common-sense, scriptural interpretation of Protestantism, rather than on the divinely revealed interpretation of the Orthodox Holy Fathers. However, when he actually studied books by leading scientific creationists, in particular The Genesis Flood and Scientific Creationism, both by Dr. Henry Morris, He was impressed by their careful research and sober, thoughtful presentation. Their presentation of the creation model, he wrote, is a promising approach to a more objective view of the whole question. Father Seraphim looked to scientific creationists not to resolve questions of theology and philosophy. For these questions, of course, he turned to the Holy Fathers, as well as to traditional Orthodox philosophers such as Ivan V. Kirievsky, Bishop Ignatius Bryanchaninov, and Konstantin Leontiev. Rather, he used the work of the scientific creationists exclusively to deal with questions raised by modern science, in order to support the teachings he had already found in patristic theology. Although these scientists indeed lacked the patristic understanding of the nature of man and the first created world, and in general the whole patristic field of commentary on Genesis, their books presented facts which pointed to the fixity of the kinds of animals, the global flood, and a relatively recent creation, all of which Father Seraphim had found stated unequivocally in the writings of the Holy Fathers. Hence, without intending to, these Protestant scientists were in many ways serving as active defenders of patristic orthodoxy. Father Seraphim's respect for this courageous group of scientists only increased when he made contact with the Institute for Creation Research, located in his hometown of San Diego. He subscribed to their newsletter Acts and Facts, often discussing interesting new articles with the brothers at the monastery. Frequently he referred his fellow Orthodox Christians to the many books put out by the Institute, beginning with the introductory work Scientific Creationism, *. The esteem with which he came to regard the Institute for Creation Research can be seen in his last talk on creation/evolution, given only a few weeks before his repose, in which he spoke at the length about the Institute and its work. See Appendix 3, pages 615 to 25. Return to text. 8. The Survival Course and the Courses on Genesis. The book that Father Seraphim planned was never finished. A.Y. sent rough drafts of his own sections to Father Seraphim, which the latter revised and augmented with his own writings, even sending it to a professor of natural sciences for review. But still the book remained in a rough and fragmentary state. In the meantime, however, Father Seraphim continued to do research, write and speak on evolution and the patristic view of creation. In the summer of 1975, with the aim of giving pilgrims to the monastery a foundation in orthodoxy, Fathers Herman and Seraphim held a 3-week course, naming it the New Valam Theological Academy. Father Seraphim gave a series of lectures on the development of Western thought from the Great Schism to the present. For all the talks he wrote extensive outlines, organizing the vast historical and philosophical research he had done for the kingdom of man and the kingdom of God. This was the ripened fruit, not only of that early research, but also of his rich store of experience as an Orthodox Christian. He was now much better equipped than before to present his knowledge in a way that would have a practical application to the lives of contemporary people. He called his lecture series a survival course because of his belief that, in order for people to survive as Orthodox Christians nowadays, they had to understand the apostasy, to know why the modern age is the way it is. In order to protect oneself, one must have an idea of the strategy of one's enemy. Father Seraphim also called his classes a course in Orthodox self-defense. 12 lectures were given by Father Seraphim, each of them several hours long. The 11th lecture was on the subject of evolution. Here Father Seraphim brought to bear not only his early research, but also his more recent studies for the proposed book on the patristic understanding of creation. In the lecture, he discussed evolution from all the different points of view, the historical, scientific, philosophical, and theological, and ended with a presentation of the various expressions of Christian evolutionism, especially that of Teilhard de Chardin. The lecture was thus a rich summary of all his thoughts on the subject up until 1975. In subsequent years, Father Seraphim continued to write notes and outlines on creation and evolution. Then in 1981, only a year before his death, he took up the subject again in earnest. During the New Valam Theological Academy course in the summer of that year, he gave a series of classes on the patristic interpretation of the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis. He put much effort into these classes beforehand, writing out an extensive manuscript of a verse-by-verse commentary filled with patristic quotations, many of which he translated himself. His 8 years of contemplating, reading, and praying about this subject had not been in vain. His series of classes was the product of a matured patristic mind, of one who, perhaps more than anyone else in modern times, had searched through the whole sum of the teaching of the Fathers in order to find and elucidate the single patristic doctrine of creation. And how exalted was the teaching of the Fathers that he poured forth, how much more inspiring than the attempts of others to conform the Holy Fathers to modern intellectual fashions. At the next Academy course in the summer of 1982, Father Seraphim continued his commentary on Genesis, this time discussing the 4th to the 11th chapters. Within 2 weeks after finishing these classes, he unexpectedly fell ill, and within another week he reposed in the Lord. His patristic commentary on Genesis, therefore, was the last achievement of his life. 9. The plan of the book. In Father Seraphim's early plans for the proposed book, he thought it best to begin with a discussion of evolution first, showing that it has no coercive scientific evidence to support it, and then to present the patristic understanding of creation. At that time, he thought that this was necessary because before people could even take the patristic teaching seriously, they first had to understand that what they had learned all their lives about the undisputed fact of evolution was in fact disputed. At the end of his life, Father Seraphim thought differently. In his last stated plan of the proposed book, he said it should begin with his patristic commentary on Genesis, i.e., his 1981 and 1982 lecture series, which would be followed by a discussion of evolution. The whole outline of it now becomes clear to me, he wrote. It should be called something positive, no evolution in the title, such as Genesis, creation and early man, an orthodox view, and the first and main part should be simply an orthodox interpretation, according to St. John Chrysostom, St. Ephraim, etc., of the first chapters of Genesis, discussing problems raised by modern men in the course of the discussion. Then, as the secondary thought, less than half the book, a discussion of the whole question of evolution. In the present posthumous compilation, we have followed this plan. Why did Father Seraphim change his plan for the book? One clue may be found in the following words which Father Seraphim wrote in the spring of 1981. Thinking about my Genesis course this summer, I was rereading part of Dr. Calamiro's letters. How discouraging. One loses all inspiration to get tangled up in this subject, seeing how he handles it. Anyone who is really converted to Christianity will surely begin to rethink his whole intellectual outlook, won't he? Isn't the real problem that Dr. Calamiro's and others are intellectuals who haven't fully converted, or have brought their intellectual baggage with them into orthodoxy? Father Seraphim had frankly become bored with the idea of having to present the patristic teaching on creation exclusively as it related to the modern intellectual baggage of evolutionism. He had done this in his letter to Dr. Calamiro's back in 1974, but now, as he was preparing his patristic commentary 8 years later, he had distanced himself from the controversy. He saw that the whole weight of the patristic teaching on the creation was so powerful and compelling that the unproved assumptions and confused thinking of modern evolutionists paled in comparison. The patristic teaching, Father Seraphim saw, could stand on its own divine authority, even before modern minds raised on evolutionary teaching, and a discussion of evolution was only needed as a secondary consideration. 10. Developments in the 1980s. This was probably the main reason why Father Seraphim wanted to reverse the original order of the book. But there was possibly another reason. In the last 2 years of Father Seraphim's life, a change had begun to occur in the public's acceptance of evolution. We have mentioned earlier how, in the 1960s and 1970s, the growing doubts of scientists about neo-Darwinism had been mostly hidden behind the walls of the scientific community. By the end of the 70s, these walls began to crumble. The first fissure occurred when the prominent paleontologists Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould publicized their new evolutionary theory of punctuated equilibrium to account for the lack of transitional, evolutionary forms in the fossil record, which forms would be expected according to classical neo-Darwinism. The new theory was not of great interest to the general public, but what was regarded as really newsworthy was that, contrary to popular belief, the fossil record did not at all fit Darwinian expectations. Gould went so far as to call the lack of transitional forms the trade secret of paleontology. This became international news, and it set in motion the next phase in the crumbling of the Darwinian edifice. Another extremely important development, beginning in 1980, was the resurgence of catastrophism in geology. Geologists began to challenge the reigning uniformitarian model that had inspired Darwin, the idea that the sedimentary layers were formed gradually at constant rates, demonstrating that it was incapable of accounting for the rock beds of the Earth's crust, especially the fossil deposits. A number of geologists calling themselves neo-catastrophists have thus returned to the idea that practically all the strata were formed by floods and other such catastrophes. Although they reject biblical catastrophism and retain the standard evolutionary/uniformitarian framework of billions of years, these non-creationist geologists have offered secular confirmation of what flood geologists such as Henry Morris have been saying for years. In the years following Father Seraphim's repose in 1982, new developments have continued to be seen. More non-Christian, non-creationist scientists have made known the fact that the neo-Darwinian theory does not account for the new data in the fields of geology, paleontology, astronomy, genetics, physics, biochemistry, and other sciences. Some are looking for a new model, though they hardly know where to turn. It is of course too much to assume they will all turn to the creation model, since, as Father Seraphim pointed out, neither creation nor evolution can be conclusively proved. Both are a matter of faith and philosophy, of a choice of presuppositions. A number of good books have come out since Father Seraphim's death, which have helped to bring the fallacies of neo-Darwinism into public view. In 1985 there appeared a book by Australian molecular biologist Michael Denton, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, which offered a systematic critique of the current evolutionary model from a variety of scientific disciplines. From his own specialty, Denton showed that the discoveries of molecular biologists are casting more and more doubt on Darwinian claims. 11. Developments in the 1990s. Philip E. Johnson. The most interesting and unexpected event in the evolution debate in recent years has been the rise of a professor of law, Philip E. Johnson, as one of the world's leading critics of Darwinism. Johnson, who has taught law at the University of California at Berkeley for nearly 30 years, says that one of his specialties is analyzing the logic of arguments and identifying the assumptions that lie behind those arguments. In 1987, in reading the arguments for evolution in Richard Dawkins' book The Blind Watchmaker, he noticed that they were based on rhetoric rather than hard science. I could see, he recalls, that Dawkins achieved his word magic by the very tools that are familiar to us lawyers. I picked up one book after another, and became increasingly fascinated with the obvious difficulties in the Darwinist case, difficulties that were being evaded by tricky rhetoric and emphatic repetition. Johnson also noticed the way his scientific colleagues responded when he asked hard questions about Darwinism. Instead of taking the intellectual questions seriously and responding to them, they would answer with all sorts of evasions and vague language, making it impossible to discuss the real objections to Darwinism. This is the way people talk when they're trying very hard not to understand something. Another tip-off was the sharp contrast I noticed between the extremely dogmatic tone that Darwinists use when addressing the general public and the occasional frank acknowledgments, in scientific circles, of serious problems with the theory. It was an enormous shock to me getting into this to see, in fact, how bad the reasoning really is, how illogical the whole scientific field of evolution is, and how resistant the scientists are to having any logic brought into it. So I felt like there was a real opportunity for somebody outside of science whose interest was in good logical thinking, rather than promoting any one particular set of solutions. And that's the mission I've been on ever since. Biologists who spend their lifetimes studying biology will be legitimate authorities, obviously, on the details of what they've learned in that investigation, and an outsider can't really challenge that, but an outsider definitely can challenge their thinking, particularly when it turns out that they believe in what they believe in not because of what they know as biologists, but in spite of what they know as biologists. It's a philosophical movement based on materialism. So that's a thinking issue, and it's really more within my discipline than it's within theirs. In 1991, Professor Johnson came out with the book Darwin on Trial. His clear-headedness in cutting through the rhetoric of Darwinism and exposing the logical foundations of the controversy quickly won him the respect of creationists and non-creationists alike, and also the ire of the die-hard evolutionists, who to this day have not succeeding in refuting a single one of his arguments. Johnson's work has inspired more scientists to come into the open with their own hard questions about evolutionary theory. The most well-known among these is Professor of Biochemistry Michael B., who in his 1996 book Darwin's Black Box shows that the astonishing new discoveries of biochemistry cannot be accommodated by any form of Darwinism. He presents evidence from his field that interdependent biochemical machines must have been designed, although not being a creationist, he does not positively identify the designer. In 1997, another thought-provoking book landed a strong blow against Darwinism, Not by Chance, by Dr. Lee Spetner. An Israeli biophysicist and expert on the genetic code, Spettner has spent 30 years researching the possibility of evolution on the genetic level. He not only shows why random mutations will never produce the changes that evolutionists claim, but also offers new scientific avenues for investigating how variation occurs within the strict genetic limits of each kind of organism. The following year saw the publication of yet another major contribution, the design inference by William A. Dembski, a professor of mathematics and philosophy, and a recent convert to Orthodox Christianity. Footnote: another Orthodox Christian presently active in refuting evolutionism is John Mark Reynolds, professor of philosophy at Biola University. In a recent 1999 anthology, he affirms that the fathers from the 1st century forward overwhelmingly took a young Earth, global flood view. Simply discarding the views of the fathers is not an option for any thoughtful Christian. Moreland and Reynolds, edition, 3 Views on Creation and Evolution, page 97. Return to text. On the basis of mathematical probability, Dembski demonstrates conclusively that undirected natural causes cannot account for biological complexity. As such contributions continue to be made, Professor Johnson uses them to advance the case for a creator. With his background in political theory, he is a careful strategist. He sees his work and the work of others like him in terms of a wedge strategy. The idea, he says, is that you get a few people out promoting a new way of thinking and new ideas. It's very shocking, and they take a lot of abuse. The thing is that you have to have people that talk a lot about the issue and get it up front and take the punishment and take all the abuse, and then you get people used to talking about it. It becomes an issue they're used to hearing about, and you get a few more people and a few more, and then eventually you've legitimated it as a regular part of the academic discussion. And that's my goal, to legitimate the argument over evolution, and particularly over the Darwinian mechanism and its supposed creative power, to legitimate that as a mainstream scientific and academic issue. As soon as we can do that and put the spotlight on it, then everybody knows that there is no evidence. So we can't lose the argument. We're bound to win it. We just have to normalize it, and that takes patience and persistence, and that's what we are applying. Professor Johnson is also an admirer of Father Seraphim, and has sought to make Father Seraphim's life and work more widely known. Footnote: see Philip Johnson's review of Father Seraphim's biography, published first in Books and Culture, September/October, 1997, and later in the collection of Johnson's essays, Objections Sustained, pages 173 to 78. Return to text. 12. Changes in the Orthodox world. The wedge of which Professor Johnson speaks has not been without repercussions in the Orthodox world. In 1998, The Christian Activist, a popular Orthodox journal that reached 75,000 Orthodox Christians of all backgrounds, published an article by Dr. Calamiros, who had recently reposed, which claimed that modern evolutionary theory was compatible with Orthodox Christianity. There was of course nothing unusual about this. As we have seen, Orthodox journals in America had shown acceptance of evolutionism many times in the past. What was unusual and surprising was the reader's reaction to Dr. Calamiros' article. The Christian Activist had always received large amounts of mail, but this time they were inundated. In the following issue, the publisher wrote, "We received more letters to the editor about issue number 11 than any other prior issue. We also received more letters on eternal will, the article on creation by Dr. Calamiros, than any article we have ever published, all of them in disagreement with his views." The editor wisely decided to print large portions of Father Seraphim's letter to Dr. Calamiros, with a statement that Father Seraphim's presentation of the Church Fathers on the subject of evolution was indeed the traditional, Orthodox one. Footnote: Father Seraphim's letter to Dr. Calamiros had previously been published in a special double issue of the Orthodox journal Epiphany, fall 1989-winter 1990, edited and compiled by Father Andrew Rossi and Stephen Muratori. This groundbreaking issue, the first work of its kind to appear in the American Orthodox press, also included scientific and philosophical refutations of evolution by William A. Dembski, Wolfgang Smith, and others. Return to text. The response to the 1998 Christian Activist article represented a major shift since the 1970s, when pro-evolution articles evoked nothing but cautious silence or open approval in mainstream Orthodox circles. At that time, Father Seraphim had gone against public opinion in contemporary American Orthodoxy, and was thus subjected to criticism by his fellow Orthodox. Now public opinion has begun to catch up with him. 3. Beyond Darwinism. Interestingly, Father Seraphim predicted these developments. In his writings and talks, he said that atheism/agnosticism in modern science and philosophy, which relies heavily on Darwinian theory, would inevitably wane. This will be a boon for traditional Christians and for those seeking the true God, but for others, Father Seraphim said, it will lead to a vague deism and various shades of pantheism that will characterize the deceptive religion of the future. Asterisk. Philip E. Johnson, as a Christian who is on the front lines of the creation/evolution debate, agrees with the prognosis that Father Seraphim made over 2 decades ago. It is what all my friends and I have been discussing, he says. Scientific materialism is waning, but unhealthy forms of religion will largely take its place. Asterisk. For Orthodox Christians, this is all the more reason to cling firmly to the common teaching of the Holy Fathers, whom Father Seraphim called a sure guide to true Christianity. 14. The present book. The present volume has been compiled from the following mate. Real, all of it by Father Seraphim. 1. Letter to Dr. Calamiros, 1974. 2. Lecture 11 of the Survival Course, in 1975, which includes both Father Seraphim's brief critique of the evolutionary model and his discussion of Christian evolutionism. 3. Patristic Commentary on Genesis, 1981 and 1982, taken both from Father Seraphim's manuscript and from his oral delivery, including the question and answer sessions. 4. Letters from 1974 to 1981. 5. Miscellaneous notes, including outlines, brief essays, and Father Seraphim's own additions to A.Y.'s unfinished chapters. Although Father Seraphim never lived to finalize the book he planned, the present volume, taken from his own writings and lectures, covers all the main areas that he wanted discussed. Footnote. Since this is a compilation of separate bodies of work done at different times for different purposes, there is some repetition of patristic passages. Had Father Seraphim lived to complete this book himself, these repetitions would of course not occur. We have elected to allow for them in this posthumous collection, so as not to disturb the integrity and continuity of each separate work. Return to text. In fact, in some ways this posthumous collection is more full than the book he envisioned. For example, some of Father Seraphim's most interesting theological observations are found in the taped transcriptions of his question and answer sessions, Part 4, and some of his most concise and penetrating thoughts about evolutionism are contained in the selections from his letters, Part 5. Father Seraphim's discussion of the scientific side of the creation/evolution issue does not represent as full a treatment as he had envisioned for the book, nor is it fully up to date. We have attempted to remedy this situation by including 1. Professor Johnson's introduction on the reconsideration of Darwinism today. 2. Explanatory footnotes to Father Seraphim's discussion, with references to more recent literature. 3. An article on radiometric dating to supplement Father Seraphim's observations, Appendix 4. And 4. A list of suggested reading, including the most up-to-date resources, Appendix 5. 15. This book's primary contribution to the world. However, it is not in its discussion of scientific issues that the uniqueness of this book lies. As we have seen, there is now plenty of excellent material by both creationists and non-creationists, which brings to light these issues. Rather, this book adds a unique dimension to the current creation/evolution debate by presenting, in a penetrating, detailed yet unadorned way, the otherworldly mind of the Holy Fathers as it perceives the creation, the first created world, the natures of created things, and the original nature of man. In overcoming the temptation which had been bred in him from childhood, to feel he knew better than the ancients, Father Seraphim revealed how noble, how utterly treasurable is the patristic mind. Clearly, from his writing one can see that this is no ordinary human mind, but something divine. The prophet Moses, the author of Genesis, had received his knowledge of the creation from divine vision, plus theoria in Greek. The Holy Fathers who commented on the Scriptures were also partakers of divine theoria, and thus they are the only sure interpreters of Moses' text. Father Seraphim, having immersed himself in the mind of the Fathers, presented to the modern world the patristic vision of the cosmos, and thus raised the discussion far above the merely rational and scientific. All creationists, whether biblical or non-biblical, have much to learn from Father Seraphim's exposition. The non-biblical creationists will find in the teaching of the Fathers a mystical illumination of the book of Genesis, and thus they may look more closely at that book as a divinely inspired prophecy of the past. Biblical creationists will likewise find that the patristic testimony opens up new dimensions in their understanding of the Bible, new levels of meaning that they never could have reached through normal exegetically means. Footnote: some creationist writings contain mistaken ideas about the Holy Fathers, based on the idea that Christianity was corrupted from the time of Saint Constantine to the Protestant Reformation. It is hoped that the present book will help encourage a re-examination of the Holy Fathers, so that biblical creationists of all backgrounds will see that the Holy Fathers do indeed uphold the basic positions of present-day creation scientists, and can in fact take their understanding to a higher level. It appears that such a re-examination has already begun. In 1991, Creation Research Society quarterly printed an article affirming St. Basil's interpretation of Genesis, an early view of Genesis 1, CR's Quarterly, Volume 27, pages 138 to 39, which in 1994 was adapted and reprinted in another leading creationist magazine, Creation Ex Nihilo. Genesis means what it says. Creation Ex Nihilo, Volume 16, Number 3, page 23. More recently, molecular biologist Jonathan Wells has admirably defended the teaching of the Holy Fathers on creation. See his article Abusing Theology, in Origins and Design, Volume 19, Number 1, 1998, as has British creation scientist Malcolm Bowden. See his 1998 book True Science Agrees with the Bible, pages 38 to 40. Return to text. Once one acquires the mind of the Fathers as Father Seraphim did, one can never view the book of Genesis as merely an allegory. But more than this, one can never view the present world as before. Why? Because the Holy Fathers, like the prophet Moses, mystically perceived the world as it was first created. They taught from experience that the world was originally incorruptible, of a higher order than the material world, which came into being after man's fall. A modern-day Holy Father, Saint Barsanuphius of Optina, 1845 to 1913, put it this way: the beautiful things of this world are only hints of that beauty with which the first created world was filled, as Adam and Eve saw it. That beauty was destroyed by the sin of the first people. Imagine a marvelous statue by a great master, and suddenly someone smashes it like a thunderbolt. What will remain of it? Fragments. We can pick them up, we can search out the neck, a portion of an arm, or the face. Indications of the beauty of the lines are preserved in these separate fragments, but they no longer produce for us the former harmony, the former wholeness and beauty. Thus also did the fall into sin of the first people destroy the beauty of God's world, and there remain to us only fragments of it, by which we may judge concerning the primordial beauty. Once, when standing before a window at night, Saint Barsanuphius pointed to the moon and said to his spiritual children, "Look, what a picture! This is left to us as a consolation." It's no wonder that the prophet David said, "Thou hast gladdened me, O Lord, by thy works," Psalms 91 verse 3. Thou hast gladdened me, he says, although this is only a hint of that wondrous beauty, incomprehensible to human thought, which was originally created. We don't know what kind of moon there was then, what kind of sun, what kind of light. All of this changed after the fall. The Holy Fathers' vision of the first created world was at the same time a glimpse of the future age. As Saint Barsanuphius said, there will come a time of worldwide cataclysm, and the whole world will burst into flame. The earth and sun and moon will burn, everything will vanish, and a new world will rise up, more beautiful than the one which the first people contemplated. Then will begin eternal, joyous life, total blessedness in Christ. And it is for this blessed life that the human soul pines even now on earth. Father Seraphim, in acquiring the patristic mind, lived with this image ever before him. In the morning, before church services, he had a practice of circling the entire monastery grounds. As the golden glow of the morning light filtered through the broad canopy of oak leaves, Father Seraphim could be seen blessing and even kissing the trees. "What's this?" Father Herman once asked him. "Kissing trees." Father Seraphim looked up, smiling radiantly, and continued walking. Father Seraphim knew better than anyone that this old earth, weighed down by the fallenness of man, had not long to live, that it would be obliterated in the twinkling of an eye, transfigured into a new earth. And yet, as Father Herman realized while he watched him make his rounds, Father Seraphim was kissing the very fragments of the lost beauty of the original creation. He wanted to die, Father Herman says, to melt into the earth, which will be transformed. The very idea of the tree he kissed was otherworldly, For trees were originally created incorruptible in paradise, according to the teaching of Saint Gregory of Sinai. In his commentary on Genesis, Father Seraphim made a self-revelatory statement which confirmed this. In the peaceful murmur of the forests, where so many ascetic strugglers have taken refuge, can we not see a reminder of the paradise of vegetation originally intended for our dwelling and food, and still existing for those able to ascend, like St. Paul, to behold it? Father Seraphim also had a great appreciation of the animal kingdom, both the many wild animals which freely roamed around the monastery, and the monastery's many domesticated animals. Ever since he was a boy, he had shown this appreciation, which had inspired him to spend 3 summer vacations studying zoology at the Junior Summer School of Science in San Diego. Now that he was an Orthodox monk living in the wilderness, he viewed animals in a more sublime light, even while realizing that they too had been affected by man's primordial fall. Father Herman recalls a quiet moment when some of the monastery animals came up to them. "From your point of view," Father Herman asked in a reflective mood, "what are animals all about?" Father Seraphim replied, "They have something to do with paradise." 16. The nature of man. According to Father Seraphim, the most important question which is raised for Orthodox theology by the modern theory of evolution is the nature of man, and in particular the nature of the first created man Adam. Through rationalism, and in particular through evolutionism, modern secular man has lost an awareness of what he was like before the fall, when he, like paradise itself, was incorruptible. As Father Seraphim came to realize, most contemporary Christians, including Orthodox Christians, have also lost this awareness, and this is one of the biggest problems of Christianity today. Without an awareness of our original nature, we cannot know what it is we should be striving to get back to. We cannot know what we are made for. The only way to regain this awareness is, again, to acquire the mind of the Holy Fathers. That is why the present book adds a vital dimension, not only to the current creation/evolution debate, but literally to all aspects of human life. With the opening of their eyes through the transgression, Father Seraphim wrote, Adam and Eve have already lost the life of paradise. From now on their eyes will be open to the lower things of this earth, and they will see only with difficulty the higher things of God. They are no longer dispassionate, but have begun the passionate earthly life we still have today. By becoming dispassionate through prayer and ascetic struggle, the Orthodox saints throughout the ages restored in themselves, while yet in a corruptible body, some measure of the state of pre-fall Adam. Like him, they were shown to be impervious to the elements. Like him, they were masters and stewards of creation, and all creatures obeyed them. Adam was in a state of sobriety, Father Seraphim said elsewhere. He looked at things and saw them the way they were. There was no double thought like we have in our fallen state, no looking at things and imagining something else. Through Christ, the saints also returned to this pre-fall state of sobriety, nipsis in Greek. With pure, open awareness, they perceived not only the original nature of man, but also the distinct natures of created things, ideas of the creative mind of God. Father Seraphim, in reading the lives of these saints, especially the ascetic desert dwellers, was fascinated by these almost contemporary images of what man was in the beginning, and likewise of what he will be in the future age, when he will be raised up in a body incorruptible. In following in their footsteps, Father Seraphim prayed much, cultivated the lofty virtues of sobriety and dispassion, and ascended with the saints beyond this corruptible earth. I could see, recalls Father Herman, that not only was his mind working, but his heart was involved, and his heart caught those things you just can't get, as a rational being, from books. Things were open to him, but he couldn't tell of them because others wouldn't understand. That's why he said so few words, even when I urged him to reveal the fruits of his contemplation. He was not at home in the world, he had no lust for life, and that's why he could go so high into superconsciousness. From this vantage point, Father Seraphim shared the experience of the saints in glimpsing the original nature of man and the natures of created things. Thus, he saw evolution as untenable, not only because the Holy Fathers said so, although for him that was reason enough in itself, or because there was no true scientific evidence for it, but also because he recognized through the light of inner sight that evolutionism abolishes man's original nature, takes away man's awareness of paradise and his fall from it, and destroys the divinely established distinction between the natures of created things. Through revelation from above, the prophet Moses described the creation and the first created world. Through the grace of Christ working within them, the Holy Fathers provided further illumination of Moses' words. And finally, through the same action of grace, a holy father of our own times, Father Seraphim Rose, has pierced through the delusion of evolutionism and illuminated the teachings of the Fathers for contemporary truth seekers. It is our hope and prayer that more and more of these seekers will catch the message. Through the work of people like Professors Johnson, Spetner, and Dembski, they can see that, at the very least, evolution has not been proved nor is it provable. Through the work of the scientific creationists, they can examine the great mass of scientific evidence that points to the veracity of Genesis as an historical account. And then, through the Holy Fathers of the Orthodox Church, they can raise their minds and hearts above this fallen, corruptible earth. From there they will view the world and themselves as they are in truth, and as they are meant to be. Hieromynch Damascene. St. Herman of Alaska Monastery. Commemoration of St. John Maximovich. June 19/July 2, 1999.